I'll never forget that day, when my life took an unexpected turn. The sunlight was streaming through my apartment window, illuminating the family photos on the wall. Among them, one photo particularly caught my eye, that of Sandra Smith. She was my beloved mother-in-law, whose smile always radiated warmth. Little did I know that this photo would become a painful reminder of her absence and mark the beginning of a family storm that would shake the very foundation of my existence. My name is Haley. Until that day, my life had been wrapped in the gentle embrace of everyday normalcy. I felt blessed to have married Andrew Smith, Sandra's only son, and to have been welcomed into what seemed like a loving, united family. Sandra, especially, treated me like her own daughter from day one. I can still vividly remember the first time I met her. It was at a family dinner shortly after Andrew and I started dating. I was so nervous I could barely hold my wine glass steady, but Sandra gently took my hand and whispered, "Relax, sweetheart. I promise I don't bite." Her warm smile and eyes twinkling with humor instantly put me at ease. From that moment on, our relationship grew deeper than I could have ever imagined. As years passed, Sandra became my confidant, mentor, and in many ways, the mother figure I had always longed for. In her spacious living room, over cups of tea, we shared everything from daily trivialities to our deepest secrets. She would often tell me, "Haley, my sweet girl, you're the daughter I always wanted. I thank fate every day for bringing you into my life." I felt equally blessed. Sandra was more than just a mother-in-law, she was a true friend, an ally in difficult times, and a companion in joy. Her generosity was boundless, and her unconditional love wrapped around me like a blanket. That's why when the phone rang that fateful spring morning, I felt my world crumbling. Andrew's voice on the other end was trembling, barely able to form the words. The shock hit me immediately. How could this be? Just last week, we had been making travel plans together. Sandra, at 68, had been full of vitality and future plans. The fact that she was no longer with us seemed like a cruel joke of fate. The days that followed were filled with tears, comforting embraces, and funeral arrangements. The house that had once been a sanctuary of warmth and laughter was now shrouded in heavy silence. As we sorted through her belongings, every item, every photograph triggered a flood of memories that threatened to drown me in grief. In the midst of my grief, I received news that would forever alter the course of my life. Michael Brown, our family lawyer, called us to his office for the reading of the will. I can still remember walking into that sparse office with Andrew, both of us in black, our eyes red from crying. Michael Brown, despite his stern appearance, greeted us with compassionate eyes, shaking our hands and offering his condolences. Without preamble, he began reading a document that Sandra had prepared months earlier. He read the words that hit me like a thunderbolt. Sandra Smith, being of sound mind, had declared her intention to bequeath all her property and possessions to me, her beloved daughter-in-law, Haley Miller. I felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind reeled with disbelief at what I heard, leaving me confused and with a tightness in my chest. All of her estate, to me? I turned to look at Andrew, desperately hoping to see the same shock I felt mirrored in his face. Instead, what I saw was something darker beneath his expression of disbelief, something I couldn't quite understand in that moment. Michael Brown continued reading, detailing the extent of the inheritance. The list seemed endless of real estate properties, a vacation home, shares in several companies, and substantial cash assets. With each word, I felt the weight of responsibility settling heavier on my shoulders. But why me? I asked the lawyer when he finished reading. I couldn't help but protest, pointing out that Andrew was her son, her only direct family. Michael Brown looked at me over his glasses with understanding yet firmness, assuring me there was no mistake. He told me that Sandra had been very clear about her wishes. Then he handed me a letter. With trembling hands, I took the envelope he offered, which would explain her decision. Sandra's elegant handwriting adorned the paper. As I opened the envelope, I could almost hear her voice reading the words to me, as if she were right there in the room. With trembling hands, I read Sandra's letter again and again, her words piercing my heart with each line. She wrote that if I was reading this, she was no longer in this world, but asked me not to be too sad, saying she had lived a fulfilled and happy life. Sandra expressed her gratitude, telling me that much of her happiness came from me, that I had been a light in their lives from the day I entered it. She said my kindness, strength, and sincerity had reminded her of what truly mattered in life day after day. The letter continued, explaining that I wasn't just a daughter-in-law but the daughter she had always dreamed of having. She acknowledged that her decision to leave everything to me might seem surprising, or unfair to some, but she knew my heart. Sandra expressed her belief that I would manage the inheritance with wisdom and compassion. She asked me to take care of our family, including Andrew, and use these assets for the good of the world. She reminded me that true value lies not in material possessions, but in the love we give and receive. The letter ended with her saying this was her way of returning some of the love I had given her, signed with all her love. Tears streamed down my face as I read and reread those precious words. I felt overwhelmed by the love and trust Sandra had placed in me. My body trembled with deep gratitude and the weight of responsibility she had entrusted to me. I looked at Andrew, yearning to share this emotional moment, seeking comfort in his presence. But what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. Instead of the loving, understanding man I knew, I saw something dark and unfamiliar in his expression. Though I couldn't comprehend it then, that look would later reveal itself as a mixture of greed and resentment. As we left Michael Brown's office, we were enveloped in a tense silence. The usually friendly streets now felt like a hostile maze. Though Andrew walked beside me, he felt miles away. I tried to break the silence, asking him what he thought about all this and admitting I didn't know what to do. His response was nothing more than a low growl. He coldly told me we would talk at home. The walk back to our apartment felt like the longest journey of my life. Each step brought us closer to an inevitable confrontation. Yet I wasn't prepared for the conflict that lay ahead. That night, as Andrew slept with his back turned to me in our bed, I lay awake, my mind racing. I thought about Sandra and the extraordinary trust she had placed in me. How could I possibly live up to her expectations? How was I supposed to handle this sudden wealth and responsibility? But more than these concerns, my heart was gripped by the fear that my relationship with Andrew had fundamentally changed. I feared that Sandra's generosity, rather than being a blessing, would become the seed of discord that would destroy everything I loved. As the night wore on and the clock ticked relentlessly, I realized that our stable, happy life would soon change dramatically. The inheritance Sandra had entrusted to me with such love loomed over me like storm clouds, promising unimaginable changes. I closed my eyes, trying to find comfort in happy memories of Sandra, but even in my dreams, I could see the shadows of what was to come. I knew I had to prepare myself for a battle I never wanted, armed only with whatever strength and determination I could muster. In the days following the reading of the will, our house was shrouded in tension thick as fog. Andrew barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were brief and cold. I tried to reach out to him, to recapture the intimacy we once shared, but it was like hitting an invisible wall. One morning, as I was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, I heard Andrew's heavy footsteps approaching. I turned around and greeted him with a hopeful smile. I offered him coffee and asked if we could talk. But my words died in my throat when I saw his expression. His eyes, once warm and loving, had become cold as ice. Without a word, he grabbed the coffee cup and smashed it to the floor. I jumped back, startled by the sound. "Andrew." I whispered, stunned and terrified by his sudden explosion. His rage-filled voice accused me of trying to buy him off with a cup of coffee, asking if I thought I could just act like nothing had happened. I stood there speechless, unable to comprehend this transformation in the man before me. This wasn't the man I had married and loved for all these years. The stranger before me was staring at me like an enemy. I pleaded with him, desperately trying to maintain my composure, telling him we needed to talk. I told him I understood how much his mother's decision had hurt him. He cut me off with a bitter laugh at the word hurt. He demanded to know how I thought he felt when his own mother had passed over him and left everything to an outsider. His words hit me like a physical blow to my stomach. An outsider? After all these years together, I couldn't believe he saw me that way. I'm not an outsider, Andrew, I managed to say, fighting to keep my voice steady. I reminded him that I was his wife, that I had been by his side for years, loving his mother as my own. That's exactly it, he shouted, his face so close to mine I could feel his breath. He accused me of manipulating and deceiving his mother to get all her money, demanding to know how I could do this to him. I caught my breath at this accusation. I couldn't believe he thought of me this way. Every moment I had spent with Sandra had been genuine. Every bit of love had been sincere. The very thought that I had acted for financial gain was unbearable to me. I would never do such a thing. I cried out with every ounce of conviction in my body. I reminded him that he knew how much I had loved his mother. He cut me off with a bitter laugh, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, muttering under his breath. Suddenly, he stopped and fixed me with a piercing stare. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as he told me it was simple. He demanded that I sign over everything Sandra had left to his name, claiming it was his inheritance and his right. The world seemed to freeze in that moment. I couldn't believe he was seriously asking me to disregard Sandra's final wishes. I can't do that, Andrew, I replied, surprised by the strength in my own voice. I told him that his mother had entrusted this inheritance to me, and I couldn't betray that trust. His face contorted with rage into something terrifying. He sneered, asking if I couldn't or wouldn't do it, adding that he'd always suspected I was after the money, but this surprised even him. Each word felt like a knife in my heart. I couldn't comprehend how the man who had once loved me could see me this way. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but forced them back. I refused to show weakness to this stranger who had replaced my Andrew. I pleaded with him to listen, suggesting we could work together, use the money to help people as his mother had wanted. He slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes jump. He roared that he didn't care what his mother had wanted, that she was dead, and that I had stolen everything that should have been his. He moved toward me, his eyes blazing with greed and hatred. I felt the blood drain from my face. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin with bruising force. He gave me his final warning, telling me to hand over everything his mother had left or I would regret it. I struggled against his grip, fear and anger battling inside my chest. I begged him to let go, crying out in pain. But instead of loosening his grip, he brought his face close to mine and whispered in a cold, low voice that I had two choices: give him everything his mother left or face divorce and complete destruction. In that moment, something inside me broke. The last illusion I had of Andrew as the loving, understanding man I married shattered completely. The person before me was a stranger, consumed by greed and hatred. With strength I didn't know I possessed, I broke free from his grip and pushed him away. No, I said, my voice trembling but firm. I told him I wouldn't yield to his threats, that his mother's inheritance was a testament of love and trust that I couldn't betray, not even for him. His face contorted with rage, twisting like a grotesque mask. He snarled that if that was my final answer, I should prepare myself, that he would take everything his mother left and make me wish I'd never set foot here. With those words, he stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me trembling and stunned. I collapsed into a chair, tears finally streaming down my face. How had it come to this? How had the man who had sworn to love and protect me become my greatest enemy? The days that followed were pure hell. Andrew moved into the guest room, and our once shared apartment became a battlefield. Every time our paths crossed, I felt his hateful, resentful glare. Even the few words we exchanged were filled with bitterness and unspoken accusations. One night, unable to bear it anymore, I decided to attempt one final conversation. I found Andrew in his study, surrounded by papers, with a half-empty whiskey bottle by his side. "Andrew," I began, my voice soft but determined. I told him we needed to talk, that this couldn't continue. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, from alcohol and lack of sleep, glaring with undisguised hostility. He demanded to know why I was there, asking if I thought he'd changed his mind or if I'd come to give him what he claimed was his. I let out a deep sigh, feeling overwhelming sadness for the man I once loved. I told him I had come to end this conflict, that his mother would never have wanted things to be like this, and that she had loved us both. He exploded, knocking over his chair as he stood up. He shouted at me not to talk about his mother, claiming I hadn't known her or what she wanted. "I did know her, Andrew," I replied with unexpected calmness. I told him I had known and loved her, and that I knew how much it would break her heart to see him now. My words seemed to strike him like a physical blow, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of the man I once knew. I saw pain and confusion flash in his eyes, but it vanished instantly, replaced by cold determination. His voice turned frighteningly quiet as he declared it was over. He told me he would call his lawyer tomorrow, that he was filing for divorce and would fight for every penny his mother had left. I felt the ground crumbling beneath my feet. Even after everything, I had still hoped somewhere we might find a solution. I had desperately wanted to believe our once shared love could overcome this. But looking at the man before me, I realized I wasn't seeing my former companion, best friend, and love, just a stranger consumed by greed. "If that's what you want, Andrew," I heard myself say with surprising strength. I told him to do what he must, but to remember that I wasn't fighting just for myself. I was fighting for his mother's legacy, and I would not betray the love and trust she had placed in me, no matter the cost. With those words, I left the study. I walked away from the man who had once been my everything. In my room, now mine alone, I began packing my belongings. Through my mingled fear and determination, I knew only one thing for certain: the battle ahead would be fierce and merciless. Andrew, blinded by greed and hatred, would try to take everything. But I had something he didn't. I had the conviction to protect Sandra's wishes. She had loved me like a daughter. As I packed my suitcase, my eyes fell on Sandra's photograph on the nightstand. Her warm smile and loving eyes gave me the strength I needed. I whispered to her photo, making a solemn promise. I vowed that I wouldn't let her final act of love become a source of hatred and destruction. I promised to fight for her legacy, her memory, and the trust she had placed in me, swearing never to betray her. With that quiet pledge, I closed my suitcase and prepared for the battle ahead. The courtroom battle would be just the beginning of a journey filled with challenges, betrayals, and truths that would shake everything I knew about the Smith family. But I was determined to face it all. I would do it for Sandra, for myself, and for everything we believed was right. The months following my separation from Andrew were a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. I moved to a small apartment in the city center. I needed distance from the house we had shared and the memories that now felt like they belonged to another life. Every morning when I woke up, I had to remind myself that this was real. The man who had once sworn eternal love had become my enemy. The first court hearing came sooner than I expected. I can still remember the sound of my heels echoing through the marble hallway's silence. My lawyer, Megan Williams, a sharp-eyed middle-aged woman with an excellent reputation, walked beside me, quietly reviewing our strategy. Just before entering the courtroom, she reminded me to stay calm. She warned me not to take any bait, saying Andrew and his lawyer would try to provoke me. I nodded and took a deep breath to steady my nerves. When the courtroom doors opened, the first thing I saw was Andrew sitting on the opposite side. He sat with his lawyer, staring at me. When our eyes met, the hatred in his gaze froze me to my core. I couldn't comprehend how love could turn into something so toxic. As the trial began, it quickly became clear this was more than just an inheritance dispute. Andrew's lawyer, Jordan Davis, began painting me as a manipulative woman. He declared to the judge in a resonating voice. He claimed they had evidence that I had unduly influenced the late Sandra Smith, exploiting her vulnerability as an elderly person to persuade her to change her will in my favor, resulting in her son being deprived of his rightful inheritance. I felt my blood boiling as I listened to these accusations. I couldn't understand how anyone could tarnish the beautiful bond Sandra and I had built. I looked at Megan, who returned my gaze with composure, before rising to make her rebuttal. She addressed the judge with unwavering determination. She declared that Jordan's claims were not only groundless but deeply offensive, explaining that my relationship with Sandra Smith was based on love and mutual respect, as evidenced by years of correspondence and testimonies from close friends. She presented medical reports proving Sandra had been of completely sound mind when deciding to leave her estate to me. The trial dragged on for hours, and I sat there trying to maintain my composure as accusations and rebuttals flew back and forth. Each new lie and distortion of truth felt like a knife twisting in my heart. During the recess, things took an unexpected turn. As I was trying to regain my composure in the hallway, John, Sandra's brother, appeared before me. His usually cheerful face was tight with tension and grief. He greeted me in a low voice, nervously glancing around. He said he needed to talk to me about something important. I hesitated for a moment, but followed him, compelled by the urgency in his eyes. We found a quiet corner away from prying eyes, and he began speaking in hushed tones. He urged me to listen carefully. He whispered that he knew Sandra had told me everything about the business and other matters, adding that Andrew was desperate, fearing everything would be exposed if it came out in court. My heart began pounding like a drum. Could it be true, the secrets Sandra had confided in me? I replied cautiously, telling him I didn't know what he meant. I remembered Megan's advice to reveal nothing. John let out a bitter laugh. He insisted that we both knew what Sandra had told me about the money laundering scheme and Swiss accounts, saying Andrew was willing to make a deal. If I gave up part of the inheritance, he would drop all accusations. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Here was confirmation of the dark secrets Sandra had shared with me during her most vulnerable time. The memory of our conversation came flooding back with vivid clarity. I remembered how one afternoon, she had looked at me with eyes full of sadness, calling me her beloved child. Then Sandra told me there was something I needed to know about the family, a heavy truth weighing on her heart. She gradually revealed the truth hidden behind the Smith family's respectable facade. The business had been a front for money laundering, with millions of dollars in illegal funds concealed in Swiss bank accounts. What pained her most was how Andrew and John had become increasingly involved in these illegal activities. They had been blinded by greed. I snapped back to the present and looked at John, my eyes filled with both pity and determination. "I'm sorry, John," I said quietly. I told him I couldn't do it, that I couldn't betray Sandra's trust. John's face hardened. He warned me That I was making a huge mistake, that I didn't understand what I was getting involved in. Before I could respond, Megan appeared, fixing John with a sharp gaze. Her voice carried an intimidating edge that showed she had heard enough. John mumbled some excuse and quickly left. Megan looked at me with concern. She asked me what that conversation was about and what secrets John had been talking about. I hesitated for a moment, but realized it was time to tell the truth. I shared everything Sandra had confided in me with Megan. With each revelation, Megan's eyes grew wider. She finally declared that this would change everything. She explained that if even half of this could be proven, we would not only win the inheritance case, but Andrew and others could face serious criminal charges. The rest of that day in court passed like a fog. When we stepped outside, the sky was already painted with sunset colors. Though exhausted, a new determination burned within me. That night in my small apartment, I pulled out the box where I had kept all the letters and documents Sandra had entrusted to me. With trembling hands, I began reviewing them one by one. They contained all the evidence she had told me about. Among the evidence were bank statements, suspicious contracts, and even photographs showing Andrew and John meeting with known criminals. Tears streamed down my face as I read through them. I cried not just for the weight of the secrets I now carried, but for the pain Sandra must have felt watching her family descend into corruption. Sandra. I whispered into the night. I asked her if this was what she had wanted. Had she wanted me to reveal the truth regardless of the consequences? As if in answer to my questions, my eyes fell on the last letter Sandra had written to me just weeks before her death. In her letter, she told me that in life, there were times when we must make difficult decisions that might hurt those we love, but were necessary to do what was right. She explained that she had entrusted these secrets to me not as a burden, but as a tool for justice. She wrote that she believed in my heart and judgment, that even on the difficult path ahead, I would do the right thing. Her words were like a beacon in the darkness. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. It wouldn't be easy, and the path ahead would be filled with danger and pain. But I felt this was my duty to Sandra, to her memory, and to the trust she had placed in me. The next morning, I visited Megan's office and handed over all the documents and evidence Sandra had entrusted to me. After reviewing them, Megan took a deep breath. She told me this was explosive material that could not only win the inheritance case but bring down the entire criminal network Andrew was involved in. I know, I replied, feeling the weight of my decision. I told her this was what Sandra had wanted, and that I couldn't let her legacy be used for further crime and corruption. Megan nodded, her face showing a mixture of admiration and concern. She warned me to remember that once we submitted this, there would be no going back. She cautioned that Andrew and his associates would fight back with everything they had, and my life might be in danger. I took a deep breath, remembering Sandra's words. I told Megan I understood, but I was ready for Sandra, for justice, and for myself, adding that it was time to stop hiding the truth. And so, the real battle began. This would be a fight that extended beyond the courtroom and into every corner of our lives. It would be a battle that would expose dark secrets, destroy reputations, and forever alter the course of many lives. As I left Megan's office, the sun was shining brightly. It felt as if the whole city was endorsing my decision. Though I didn't know what lay ahead, for the first time in a long while, I felt certain I was doing the right thing. For Sandra, and for my own sense of justice. The battle had only begun, but I was prepared to face whatever sacrifices it would take. That day, the day that would alter the course of our lives, the sky hung gray with the promise of a storm. The heavy clouds seemed to forecast the storm about to break in the courtroom. On my way to the courthouse, I felt the weight of the documents in my bag like lead. Each step brought me closer to the moment when the Smith family's dark secrets would be exposed. Megan was waiting for me on the steps of the imposing building. Her face showed firm resolve, but I could see worry in her eyes. She asked if I was ready as we climbed the stairs. I nodded, unable to find the right words. How could anyone truly be ready for what was about to unfold? The courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists, onlookers, and of course, members of the Smith family filled every corner. Andrew sat with his lawyer, his face a mask of arrogance and contempt. John sat a few rows behind, his eyes darting nervously around the room. And in the back row sat Andrew's cousin Melissa, her expression unreadable. Judge Miller, despite his stern appearance, gave the impression of fairness. He called the court to order. He announced the continuation of Smith versus Miller, noting that the defense had new evidence to present. Megan rose, her voice ringing out clear and strong. She addressed the judge, stating that we had evidence not only supporting my right to Sandra Smith's inheritance but also revealing illegal activities involving multiple members of the Smith family. A murmur spread through the courtroom. I watched the color drain from Andrew's face while John seemed to sink into his chair. The judge showed interest as he instructed Megan to proceed. What happened next was like watching an explosion in slow motion. Megan began presenting evidence one piece after another. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers to Swiss accounts, contracts with shell companies, evidence showing how they functioned as fronts for money laundering. Each time she presented evidence of Andrew and John meeting with known criminals, the courtroom fell into a frozen silence. Occasional gasps and angry murmurs broke through the silence. Megan continued, telling the judge that these documents proved extensive illegal activities, showing Andrew and John Smith's direct involvement in money laundering and tax evasion schemes. Andrew's lawyer, Jordan Davis, suddenly jumped to his feet in protest. He objected, claiming these allegations were baseless and defamatory, demanding an explanation of how these documents came into my possession. Judge Miller turned to me, asking if I could explain the origin of these documents. I stood up, feeling every eye in the courtroom fixed on me. Taking a deep breath, I drew strength from Sandra's memory and her words. "Your Honor," I began, my voice stronger than I expected. I explained that these documents had been entrusted to me by Sandra Smith herself, who had been deeply concerned about her son and brother's illegal activities. I told the court that she had wanted these documents to serve justice and restore the Smith family's honor. The silence that followed my words was deafening. I saw disbelief and betrayed fury in Andrew's eyes, while John seemed crushed by defeat. But what surprised me was Melissa's reaction. Rather than shock or anger, her face showed relief. Judge Miller carefully reviewed the evidence before speaking gravely. He declared this was a serious allegation, and given the nature of the evidence, the case needed to be referred to the prosecution as a criminal matter before proceeding further. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. Through the commotion of voices and movement, I saw two police officers approaching Andrew and John. Andrew's expression changed from shock to rage in seconds. He pointed at me, screaming that I was a traitor who had destroyed the family. As the officers handcuffed him, Andrew continued to rage, shouting that I would regret this and he would have his revenge. His threats rang in my ears as they led him away. Meanwhile, John looked aged and defeated, offering no resistance as the police took him. His eyes stared into emptiness, as if he had given up on everything. As the chaos subsided, Melissa approached me. Her expression was a mix of emotions, none of which I could quite read. Melissa spoke to me, in a low voice, asking if we could talk privately. Though hesitant, I found myself intrigued and followed her. When we reached a quiet corner of the hallway, she began to speak. Her voice trembled as she talked about what I had done that day. She told me I couldn't imagine how long they had waited for someone to have the courage to do this. I stared at her in astonishment, asking what she meant. Melissa took a deep breath before continuing. She revealed that she had been gathering evidence against Andrew and John for years, explaining that their illegal activities extended far beyond here in Switzerland, reaching across America, including her own company. My mind was reeling, trying to process this new information. When I asked for clarification, she nodded. She confessed that they had forced her into their tax evasion scheme, threatening to destroy her business if she didn't cooperate. With tears in her eyes, she added that she had been carrying this burden for so long. Now, thanks to Sandra and me, she could finally do the right thing. She reached into her bag and handed me an envelope. She explained that it contained all the information about their activities, names, dates, amounts, everything. She planned to turn herself in to the authorities and confess her involvement, seeing it as the bare minimum to start making things right. I accepted the envelope with trembling hands, overwhelmed by its significance. When I struggled to find words, she took my hand, looking at me with eyes full of gratitude. She told me not to say anything, just thanking me for having the courage she couldn't find for so long. As I watched her walk away to speak with the police officers, I felt as if the entire world had shifted in just a few hours. These revelations had not only shaken the Smith family to its core, but had also triggered the exposure of a corruption network, far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The days that followed were a whirlwind of statements, interrogations, and media coverage. The Smith family trial captured national attention, with new revelations, names, and scandals making headlines daily. I found myself at the center of a storm, hounded by reporters and drawing stares on the streets. To some people, I was a hero who stood for justice. While some saw me as a brave soul who dared to challenge a corrupt, powerful family, others branded me as a traitor who destroyed an honorable dynasty. One afternoon, I was hiding in my small apartment, seeking refuge from the relentless camera flashes and endless questions. Then came an unexpected phone call. It was Megan. Her voice was tense as she spoke my name. She urged me to turn on the news immediately. I switched on the TV and caught the live broadcast from the prison where Andrew and John were being held. The news anchor was speaking in a grave tone. He reported the shocking development that Andrew Smith had been found dead in his cell that morning, adding that authorities suspected suicide but the investigation was ongoing. The world seemed to stop spinning. Andrew, the man who had once been my everything, the man who became my fiercest enemy, was now gone. Now that it was all over, I felt a deep sadness for him spreading through my heart. The aftershocks of the revelations continued for days and weeks. John received a lengthy sentence, while Melissa got a lighter one for her cooperation. The investigation revealed that beyond the Smith family, many businesspeople and politicians were involved in an even more extensive corruption network. I struggled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I knew I had revealed the truth and honored Sandra's trust in me. Yet on the other hand, I felt acutely aware of how enormous the cost had been. The family that had once welcomed me had crumbled, and though I had won the inheritance case legally, the victory tasted bitter. One afternoon, seeking peace in my turbulent life, I was walking along the river when I stopped before Sandra's statue. I looked up at her face, seeking guidance and comfort from the bronze figure. "Sandra," I whispered as tears rolled down my cheeks. I asked her if I had done the right thing, if this was what she had truly wanted. Of course, there was no answer. All I could hear was the whisper of the river and occasional bird song. Standing there, remembering all my moments with Sandra, our conversations, laughter, and tears, a certainty began to grow in my heart. Yes, the path had been steep and painful. The consequences had been beyond anything I could have imagined. Yet I had stayed true to Sandra's wishes, faithful to truth and justice. As the sky turned gold and pink, I felt a peace I hadn't known in a long time. The future remained uncertain, full of challenges and unanswered questions. But I was ready to face it. I had Sandra's memory and the conviction that I had done the right thing, despite everything. The months following the trial revelations were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. The city that had been my home for years now felt like a place filled with unfamiliar hostility. Every corner held memories, every street a reminder of lost lives and exposed truths. One spring morning, I sat in the same courtroom where it all began, waiting for Judge Miller to deliver the final verdict in the Smith family trial. The verdict was breathtaking in its finality. He ruled in my favor, declaring Sandra Smith's will valid and recognizing my right to inherit her entire estate. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, I felt a profound emptiness. Looking around the courtroom, I saw the few remaining members of the Smith family, who had avoided arrest, glaring at me. Their eyes held a mixture of hatred and resignation that would cast a long shadow over my heart. As I left the courthouse, a swarm of reporters surged forward. Their questions swirled around me like a whirlpool. They asked how I felt about the verdict. They wanted to know my thoughts on winning the case. They questioned my plans for the Smith family fortune. They pressed for comments about Andrew Smith's suicide. Through the barrage of questions, Megan, my lawyer and now friend, guided me through the crowd to a waiting car. She whispered that I didn't have to speak if I didn't want to. But something compelled me to stop. I turned to face the reporters and spoke in a voice that didn't seem like my own. I told the reporters there were no winners in this story, only losses and painful lessons. I added that I would honor Sandra's memory by using the inheritance as she had wished. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of decisions and planning. The Smith family fortune was vast, with real estate, businesses, and investments scattered across America and beyond. I found myself surrounded by financial advisors, lawyers, and asset managers, navigating the complexities of my new situation. One afternoon, while sorting through papers in Sandra's old study at the Smith mansion, I discovered an old photo album. It contained snapshots of happier times, pictures of young Andrew laughing with his parents, John and Melissa enjoying Christmas parties. There was even a photo of Sandra at her wedding, young and radiant. In that moment, I made a firm decision to change the course of my life and honor her memory. The next day, I called a press conference. The camera flashes momentarily blinded me, but I took a deep breath and began to speak. I greeted everyone, explaining that I had called them together for an important announcement about Sandra Smith's inheritance. The reporters leaned forward, eager for information. I announced my decision to establish the Sandra Smith Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and fighting corporate corruption. A murmur spread through the room. I explained that half of the inherited assets would go to the foundation, while the other half would be used to compensate victims of the Smith family's illegal activities. Questions came flooding in from all directions. They wanted to know if I was giving up the fortune, how the foundation would operate, and what the remaining Smith family members thought of this decision. I answered as honestly as I could, explaining my vision for the foundation, and my desire to transform this tainted inheritance into something that would benefit society. The days that followed were busy but fulfilling. The Sandra Smith Foundation was established quickly, drawing both support and criticism. While we received hundreds of supportive messages from abuse survivors and anti-corruption organizations, some members of the Smith family branded me a traitor and even sent threats. Despite serious security concerns, I threw myself completely into the foundation's work. We hired a team of experts and launched programs to support abused women and promote corporate transparency. One day, working late at the office, I had an unexpected visitor. It was Melissa, just released from her prison term. Melissa spoke to me, with a voice filled with emotion. She told me she wanted to express her gratitude and offer her help. Surprised, I asked her what kind of help she meant. She nodded and explained that she thought what I was doing with the foundation was wonderful. She expressed her desire to become part of it, wanting to use her experiences and lessons learned from past mistakes to prevent other women from falling into the same traps. That conversation became a turning point. With Melissa's help, we were able to expand the foundation's programs, support more women, and strengthen our fight against corruption. However, as the foundation grew and gained recognition, I began to feel that this place was no longer where I belonged. The weight of memories and emotions had become too heavy. While searching for a place to make a fresh start, I found my answer during a business trip. It was a small coastal town in the north. I was immediately captivated by the sound of waves, the salty sea breeze, and the warmth of the local people. The decision to move wasn't easy. It meant letting go not only of painful memories, but also of peaceful afternoons with Sandra, happy days with Andrew, and friendships built over many years. On moving day, I made one last visit to Sandra's grave. I placed her favorite flowers and quietly said goodbye. Mixed feelings of sadness and gratitude washed over me. "Thank you, Sandra," I whispered. I told her I hoped I was using her legacy in the right way. Life in the seaside town felt like a breath of fresh air. I rented a small house overlooking the ocean, where the sound of waves became my daily soundtrack. While continuing to run the foundation remotely, I began exploring new interests. I joined a local marine conservation group, and slowly, my emotional wounds began to heal. One morning, while walking along the beach, I encountered a group of women doing cleanup work. As I joined their activity, the conversation turned to the Sandra Smith Foundation. A woman named Donna exclaimed in disbelief, asking if I was really from that foundation. She told me that thanks to our foundation, she had escaped an abusive relationship last year and received the strength and support to make a fresh start. Her words shook me to my core. It was the first time I had met someone who had directly received help from the foundation. Donna hugged me tightly, and my tears mingled with the salt spray on my cheeks. That encounter was a powerful moment that reminded me why I had made those decisions and kept fighting despite the pain. Despite all the hurt and loss, I had created something that was making a real difference in people's lives. As months turned into years, the Sandra Smith Foundation grew and expanded. We supported thousands of women and became pioneers in the fight against corporate corruption. I received awards and honors, but they seemed trivial compared to the satisfaction of honoring Sandra's memory in the best possible way. My personal life also blossomed in my new hometown. I made new friends, discovered new interests, and as time passed, I found myself able to open my heart to love again. I met Jordan, a local literature teacher, whose kindness and passion for life reminded me that there was still beauty in this world. One evening, while walking along the beach with Jordan, I stopped to gaze at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and pink. The sight reminded me of another sunset I had seen long ago. Jordan noticed my distant look and asked what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about the journey that had brought me here. I added that I was reflecting on all the losses, battles, and difficult decisions, but also all the good that had come from them. Jordan embraced me from behind, his presence giving me comfort. He told me that I had transformed pain into something beautiful, and that Sandra would be proud. His words resonated deeply within me. Indeed, the path had been difficult and full of unexpected challenges. Along the way, I had lost my husband, my family, and the life I once thought was stable. But I had gained something more valuable. It was the certainty that I had done the right thing, the satisfaction of not betraying Sandra's trust, and the opportunity to make positive changes in the world. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky with its final golden light of the day, I felt a deep sense of peace. Sandra's legacy would live on, transformed by my decisions, through every life touched by the foundation, every woman supported, and every corruption exposed. I, Haley Miller, once an unexpected daughter-in-law of the Smith family, had become the guardian of that legacy, and forged my own path. And this story wasn't over yet, it was just the beginning of a new chapter.